The perspectives expressed in this podcast are those of the host and guests. The views expressed are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the National Institute of Health or the United States government.
Hey, Sickle family. I'm Wumi Bakare.
And I'm Dima Hendricks. And we would like to welcome you to the Through the Genes podcast,
where we talk about living, healing, recovering, and exploring curative therapies for sickle cell disease.
We will also talk about our individual curative therapy journeys and the bond that we built as sickle cell sisters.
Episode 6, The Mental Health Perspective with Dr. Staci Martin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Through the Genes. Now, Wumi, I realized during each episode, one theme reigns true. We're always talking about mental health. And so today we want to get an expert on, and her name is Dr. Staci Martin. She will give a great perspective on not only the clinical trial process, but on mental health. She is a senior associate scientist in the pediatric oncology branch of the National Cancer Institute. Please welcome Dr. Staci Martin.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here. And we want to hear your perspective as it relates to mental health and the clinical trial process. So one thing before we get into the clinical trial process, I wanted to ask you, how do you think, in your own words, how does mental health play a part in the role of a sickle cell?
Well, that's a good question to start us off. I think that in general, people with sickle cell, as you both know, experience a lot of physical challenges. And the intensity of their pain and the other symptoms that they experience can really play a toll on your mental health in terms of anxiety and depression, even trauma sometimes. And the role of a sickle cell warrior can take over your life so that you don't really focus on any of the other aspects of who you are as a person. And being a warrior is an integral part of people's journey, but it's also not the only part of their journey. And so it can be really hard sometimes when your focus in life becomes more and more narrow, so that all you're focusing on is trying to avoid your pain or trying to find the right pain medication or the right doctor or managing the symptoms as they come up and so forth. So it can really play a toll. It can really take a profound toll on people's emotional well-being.
I think oftentimes for patients, and I will even say in the realm of sickle cell disease research and treatment, we don't necessarily pinpoint or highlight mental health as much as we should. So oftentimes for many patients, they aren't necessarily awake to the toll that sickle cell takes on their mental health until they're much older and cognizant of how the mind is a very powerful thing. And that mind-body connection is important. So can you kind of delve into a little bit, because I want to kind of set this up for especially younger audiences who are either navigating adolescence through young adulthood, who don't really recognize that their disease manifests in both a physical way and a psychological way. Can you help us establish what are some of the common mental health illnesses or diagnosis that many sickle cell warriors have, and where does this kind of stem from for patients?
So I think because, as we were just saying, people's focus in life can become more and more narrow, I think that they stop losing sight of the things in this life that they enjoy. They stop spending as much time with the people that they care about and doing the things that they love. And as we exclude those things, then we can feel more isolated. And that leads to loneliness and depression. We can also get wrapped up in something that's called the control agenda, where you spend all of your focus on trying to control your symptoms, your disease, everything about the sickle cell condition, right? And a lot of those things are not under our control. Our human minds, our minds want to control those kinds of things because they're scary and they're difficult, right? So as long as we're wrapped up in that control agenda, then it's really hard to kind of let go and see, okay, what are the things that I can have some control over, right? Like I can control how often I take my medicine or showing up for doctor's appointments, right? But I can't always control my level of pain. I can't always control when I'm going to have pain crisis. I can't always control, what other things are going to pop up, new symptoms, new conditions, and things like that. So we spend so much of our time and energy on that control agenda. We don't have anything left for the things that we care about, right? And so once we can learn to kind of accept what we can't control and not fight against it all the time, then we can spend a lot of that energy on, okay, what can I do? I may not be able to control having this condition. I may not be able to control, when my pain is going to get bad again. But I can choose to engage in things that I care about, things that mean a lot to me. I can choose to go ahead and spend time with the people that I love, or do this job that I love, and those kinds of things. When we're focused on those things, or our values, in other words, then those things can really bring a lot of meaning to our world and be very fulfilling.
So you mentioned the control agenda, which just blew my mind because I've never heard it in that way before. But I know after you articulated the definition of the control agenda, I know I have that as a warrior.
We all do at some time or another, right? Like just as a human being. So you're not alone in that, Dima.
Oh my goodness, that's mind blowing. So thank you for sharing that. And I know self-care is kind of one of those trendy words right now, those trendy topics that we all have, that we all hear, not just in the sickle cell space, but in every space with regards to mental health. What are some self-care tips or tools that you would recommend for a warrior, especially for one that has this control agenda?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that a lot of people with sickle cell, probably most people, they know about what kinds of things they can do to best manage their symptoms. They either by, listening to what their medical teams are telling them, or just from experience. Like you may learn over time, here's my limit. And if I go over that limit, I'm going to be paying for it, right? For the next few weeks sometimes, right? Or longer. And so really listening to that voice inside of us is important in helping us take care of ourselves, right? Kind of navigating those choices. Okay, do I want to go to work today if I'm in pain? Listening to your values in that moment so that your decision is based on your values rather than on the control agenda, rather than on the pain. Sometimes the answer may be, yeah, you know what, I'm going to do something really important today at work and I need to show up. Sometimes it may be, you know what, I had a rough day yesterday and I think if I go into work today, I'm going to go into a crisis. So listening to that voice and honoring it is really important in taking care of ourselves, alongside doing all the things that we've learned, getting enough rest and sleep, taking care of ourselves, to, drinking enough water, getting the nutrition that we need, and making sure you're not too cold when you go outside. I mean, you all know these are the things that people with sickle cell have to think about, right? I mean, you know that better than I do. And so sometimes we get so wrapped up in other things that we forget.
All right. So Dr. Martin, one of the things you shared with us is that depression and anxiety is a very common mental health issue that many warriors deal with over the course of their life. And in a previous episode, We spoke to a patient who's participated in CRISPR gene editing, Jimmy, and one of the things he mentioned is his life prior to the curative therapy process and what that looked like for him. Because, again, as a young Black man who is married, and at the time of his clinical trial, they had just had a baby, he kind of lost all sense of kind of grit and hope because he was going through excruciating bouts of pain that often required that he would have to like work from home or adjust his lifestyle to better accommodate his disease. So, as Dima mentioned, when we talk about self care means a series of things to everyone. And I think for warriors who are not as, I'm going to preface by saying, who are not as fully immersed in the benefits of therapy and mindful breathing and having self care tools, can you distinctively share with us what are some examples of self care? Because as Demon pointed out, it's a buzzword. Particularly post pandemic, everyone is talking about the impact of mental health because we all felt our mental health kind of getting ahead of itself when we were all on lockdown. So, can you elaborate a little bit? What would you categorize as self care? And should patients be aware of self care can mean something to you, but mean something totally different for another patient? Because I think with everything mental health, there's no one size fits all program.
Yeah, that is very true. Yeah, I think that people have to pay attention to their own inner experiences, both physically and mentally, emotionally. And I think that a lot of us don't do that. A lot of us are just kind of on autopilot a lot of the time. And so we miss out on those cues. We're not paying attention to them. One of the things that helps with that is mindfulness. Practicing mindfulness on a daily basis, meaning being in the here and now, accepting the experience for what it is. And we do that a lot of different ways. We do that through mindful breathing, mindful movement, just trying to be aware of thoughts and feelings without pushing them away when they're uncomfortable or unpleasant. And when we become more mindful, we can really tune into our bodies in a way that we may not otherwise,
right,
and learn about our limits, learn about, okay, when I get to a certain point on that pain scale, that's when I need to take care of myself. That's when I need to go rest, take a little break. And likewise with emotions, noticing our emotions, because of course our emotions play a role in our physical well-being. And so when people with sickle cell, as I've been told by many patients that I've worked with, when they get very stressed, when they're going through a really difficult time, they're more likely to have more pain, go into a crisis, that there's a relationship there. And so we also need to be aware of our emotions and our thoughts and notice those thoughts with a non-judgmental stance. Sometimes we may think, oh boy, I can't do this. No, I can't do that. I have sickle cell. I can't do that. Or I'm going to be in pain. I can't do that. And sometimes that may be true. Sometimes the best thing we can do to take care of ourselves is to take that break and hold back. But other times, if we are mindful and we tune into, okay, what's important here? Other times it may be, you know what, this is important and I do need to show up for this. And, I tell my patients that I want that choice to be based on their values rather than on the pain or control agenda.
That's good. Thank you for sharing that. But right, because we're talking about the curative therapy process. So I want to kind of change gears to that a little bit. Earlier in a few episodes ago, we spoke with Dr. Minetti, who explained the curative therapy process, and we also talked about the balancing act and the things that we had to go through in a clinical trial and in the curative therapy process.
Yeah.
So can you speak to the mental health or the mental health process of what a participant would have to go through during that time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it starts with being prepared. when we work with people who are getting ready to go through the transplant process or gene editing, gene therapy, um, we like to talk to them about, um, what will you do when you're in a lot of pain, when you're in the hospital? What will you do when you feel lonely being in the hospital, when you maybe haven't been able to connect with family and friends the same way? Let's talk about some coping techniques that you can put into place. Because once you're there and you're having a really hard time, sometimes it's really tough to step back and say, okay, what are my coping techniques? What are my options here? So I want people to think that through ahead of time. The other thing we talk about before they go through curative therapy is, who are you as a person beyond just your disease and your symptoms? What are the things that are going to stay part of your identity? Even if you are successful, and if the treatment is successful and you no longer have sickle cell, what's going to be the same about you? What are the parts of your identity that are solid and stable and going to be there for you on the other side? What are the things that might change? And a lot of times, what we learned over the years was that when people went through this process and the transplant was successful and they no longer had sickle cell, some of them have had kind of an identity crisis. They didn't know who they were anymore. And that was a surprise to me the first time a patient talked to me about that many years ago now. It's like, oh, wow, that's really interesting, and I hadn't thought of that before. But it makes a lot of sense, right? And like we talked about before, because so much of people's focus is on their disease and their symptoms and controlling their pain and so forth. And so they lose sight of all those other parts of themselves. They lose touch with them. They're disconnected from them. And so we want them to start exploring, who were you before your symptoms got so bad? Tell me about your life growing up. Tell me about what you do on the days when you don't have a lot of pain, right? What are the things that you enjoy? And let's talk about how you can reconnect with those things. I think that's a really important part of the journey.
As you were speaking, I couldn't help but remind myself of my curative therapy process. And at the time, I would say I was very new to the word mental health and therapy. Obviously, coming from an African background where, for us, where we talk about mental illness, we think of things like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, things that are way more complicated. And
Yeah.
so I was newer to mental health. But one I remember very it stays in my mind every time I think about my mental health journey was when I started the curative therapy process. I held on to hope because I was trying as much as possible to armor myself for how grueling that journey is going to be. And I always like to say it's a transformative process, both on the inside and on the outside, because you are almost switching personas, or your persona is like evolving, so to speak. And so I always you've heard me say this before on a panel where I said, the only way I can articulate an identity crisis to people who aren't familiar with it is if you've been married for 15 years and you go by Mrs. White, and then all of a sudden your husband passes away, do you then go back to your maiden name? You don't. You still remain Mrs. White, even though your husband has passed away. And so I use that analogy because I share with people that that helps you better understand why the identity crisis is difficult for a lot of patients, because all they've known is sickle cell disease. And it's almost become a security blanket. So when you go through the curative therapy process and someone takes your security blanket away, you then are like, well, then who am I?
Yeah.
And I mean, I had my curative therapy when I was 30. So at that time, you would think as a young woman, I should have known myself. But there are parts of myself that I'm still discovering today that I'm like, oh, this is interesting. I never know she was back here. And it's a beautiful encounter, but I will say I'm on the beautiful side now. But I had to go through the more difficult side of unlearning certain habits.
Yeah.
So for patients who are embarking on a curative therapy, I always say, leading up to from chemo and radiation, which are the conditioning regimen process, to your day zero, when your new cells are infused into you, something shifts mentally, because now you are navigating pain that feels different. Because again, your body is reacting to all of the rigorous procedures that it's gone through. And so I always say that is a critical moment where understanding and having your mental health toolbox is significantly beneficial. So can you kind of share with us today that, especially during those pivotal moments where you have gone through these curative therapy process, you think you know what your values are, but you are struggling with a sense of, how do I make sense of my life, and how do I review my values and decide which ones do I want to keep, which ones do I not want to keep? Because I always say, when you're a warrior, you have very unhealthy coping habits. Okay, and we all have one. I know for me, I would work myself to the bone because I always felt this need to prove myself. I want my coworkers to think I'm just as deserving. And now I have to say, you've worked hard. You have muscle memory. So on days when you're not in tip top shape, you can still function because, it's a muscle you flexed for so long. So can you kind of share with us today, what mental health tools should warriors begin to develop, at least before they delve into the curative therapy process, so that they're better equipped to adjust with this new identity, but also come to terms with survivor's guilt of seeing friends and loved ones lost to sickle cell, but then they still have the opportunity to get to the other side?
Mm-hmm. So a minute ago, you used the word evolving. And I like that you said that, because it's not just change, it's evolution, right? And some of our values stay with us our entire lives, and others change and shift, and they come in and out of focus as we go through our lives. And so, so I think that's an important point, is that we don't know what our values are going to be like a year from now, right? But it is really helpful, I think, to think about how you want to show up. That's another way of thinking about values, right? It's like, how do you want to show up for this challenge? So when you're at day zero, how do you want to show up today? When you're at 10 days out and a year out and so forth, how do you want to show up? What do you want to bring to the table? So, it may be, this is really hard and difficult, and there are tears shed, and there's pain, and there's fear, and there's trauma, but I want to still be true to my value of honesty, or treating others with kindness, whatever it is. What are the things that are important to you that day? There's also something called post-traumatic growth that's been written about in the literature a lot, where people go through these traumatic experiences. Having a very serious illness can be like a trauma, right? Going through an intense medical treatment program can be like a trauma in some ways. And so, yes, what comes with trauma is often a lot of anxiety, a lot of pain and suffering, emotionally, physically. But what can come out of that when we're on the other side of that? What is that evolution that we can look back on and see? And so those are all things that I think it's really helpful to keep in mind. What am I getting out of this? One thing that can be an interesting little exercise is for people to write a letter to their sickle cell, to talk about, boy, here's why I really hate you. And here's all the pain that you've caused me, and why you've messed up things in my life. But could I also get in touch with something good that's come out of this? Like for the two of you, and I don't mean to be presumptuous, but maybe for the two of you, if you asked yourselves that question, it would be, one good thing that's come out of it is this podcast that has helped countless people, right? So just as an example, could you write a thank you note to your sickle cell? Right. And some people aren't ready for that. So I wouldn't suggest that for everyone at every point in time. But maybe looking back, there's a point that you get to where you can do that. And it might help you. It doesn't take away the sickle cell, it doesn't take away the pain or the trauma, but maybe it can change your relationship to those things. So that can be a really helpful exercise as well. And also talking about mental health, I mean, if you have the resources to work with a therapist that can help you stay focused on those kinds of things, what you need to do to take care of yourself, to stay connected with your values. I, of course, definitely recommend that, being a therapist myself, but I think everyone can benefit from therapy. So.
And I want to mention that Wumi wrote a beautiful letter to sickle cell. And we're going to add that into the show notes.
Oh, good. Wow, that's great.
It's a beautiful, beautiful letter. And we're going to share it with the audience. But I want to go back to the curative therapy process, and I want to highlight the individuals that aren't able to pursue the process. For instance, I'm using myself as an example. I was ready to go. I went through the whole I collected my stem cells, and then it was time for chemotherapy. I wasn't able to move through the chemotherapy process. And after some complications, I was dismissed from the clinical trial. But I noticed there was a shift. Before the clinical trial, like during the clinical trial and before the clinical trial, I was prepped. They gave me therapy. They explained the process to me. I was hopeful. I was happy about what was going to happen. Excited even about, hey, I'm no longer going to have sickle cell disease. And once that transition happened of no longer being able to go through the curative therapy process, I feel like I was a little bit abandoned. There was no one there to say, hey, you weren't able to complete it. Let's talk about the loss or the tragedy of the loss, of the hope that is no longer there, and how to shift and how to have this new life of, or going back to the regular scheduled program of, you're going to have pain. You're going to age with sickle cell, or you may have an extended expiration date. You don't know when you're going to die with this thing. So I say all that to ask, what are there any new parameters, or are there any new programs or things in place for individuals that are not able to successfully go through the clinical trial process?
Wow. I honestly don't know of any, but you make me think that there should be. I know that on an individual basis, some of the patients that we work with at the National Institutes of Health who aren't able to go through the process, or who go through the process but it's not successful, we can work with them throughout that process on an individual basis. Like, we can continue working with them even when they go back home and are no longer part of the clinical trial. So we can do that one-on-one, but there isn't a formal program in place that I know of. Not at the NIH or the NHLBI, but it's so important. It's so important. My heart broke a little bit for you when you said you felt abandoned, and it's like a grieving process in a way, because you had this idea of what your life was going to be like, and then it was like the rug was pulled out from under you, and that wasn't the case anymore. And so you had to kiss that dream goodbye, so to speak. I think that it is, like I said, like a grieving process, and it's something that I think there needs to be more support for that group of people.
I don't know anyone personally who epitomizes pain into purpose more than Dima does. And I say this to mean, I think you were a fearless warrior before, but I think you are a force to be reckoned with now. And even though there will still be some grief and trauma left to unpack from what will no longer be, I feel like you found a way to superhero yourself out of the state of I'm going to grow old with this disease, and instead fuel your intent towards saying, well, then how do I make life holistically more beautiful for other warriors like me? And there will be, one of the conversations that we've had even on other episodes is that this curative therapy will just not be available for everyone. Not everyone is going to meet the eligibility criteria. Some people will get stopped in the journey for one complication or reason or another. And the truth is, some people will have aged out of the age criteria for a curative therapy. So perspectives like yours matter, and people like you matter, because even though that program didn't necessarily exist for you, you will do, knowing you as a human being, you will do anything within your power to make sure it is available for others who will get to that part of their journey as well. Because whether you realize it or not, I think you have given yourself some psychological flexibility to see other possibilities, even as you continue to grow with sickle cell disease. So as a friend, I'm saying that to you, like on a one-on-one note, like I hope you, in your quiet moments, that you recognize that the term resilience, you live it on a daily basis, because you have to be resilient to grieve something that was once treasured, but then also own your identity and your prowess and say, well, I'm not going to sit and cry over like spilled milk. I'm going to do something about it. So I hope that stays with you just by having this conversation. But Dr.
Don't
Martin, I'm going to
cry on my makeup, or you're gonna make me cry. Stop it.
Me too.
so, I had to say that because I want everyone listening to feel and experience the force that you are. And I think one thing I love about therapy is sometimes therapy has taught me to pause and observe my own life and shift my perspective and way of seeing things, which has been significantly beneficial for me. But now let's kind of talk about something that during the curative therapy process will happen, which is support. Support in the form of a partner, a caregiver, a parent, and boundaries. I felt like during my curative therapy process, I was like a customer service person where you're picking up phones of different people. I genuinely felt like that because I was trying to manage my emotions. On top of that, I was choosing and selecting what news to break to my family, because for them it was more nerve-wracking because they're like, is she gonna make it? We've heard some people don't make it, through this. Is she doing the right thing? Should she just learn to live with this disease? So many unanswered questions for them, and they wanted to be hopeful, but they also didn't want to see me disappointed if I didn't make it to the other side. But sometimes I think in the process of trying to be a customer service rep for my friends, my colleagues, my family, all those that I knew were supporting behind me, I didn't have enough time to also process my own emotions as well. Yeah. So, how does a patient establish healthy boundaries that are respectful to those around them, but they're in a position where they're also able to prioritize and unpack their own feelings?
Mm-hmm. So it's something that, we talked earlier about being prepared, right? It's something that is part of that preparation process where people have to ask themselves, what are my limits? What are the boundaries that I want to establish? Knowing that might involve some uncomfortable conversations. It might involve some hurt feelings. But I think that, what I would tell people is that even if that's the case, if there are people in your life that care about you and love you, they will get over it, and that you have to put yourself first during that process. It's all good and well when we're living our daily lives to sometimes put others first, sometimes, help others and be generous with others. But in a time like that, when you're going through a hospitalization and a therapy that's that intense, you need to put yourself first and your needs first. If you can enlist one person in your life to be your gatekeeper, that can be really helpful so that you can tell that person, here's what I want to share this week with friends and family. Maybe that person sends out a group text or an email, or maybe there's a Facebook page that you want to update once a week with your progress or something like that. So whatever feels right for you, I'd say to set that up in advance, maybe even tell people in advance before you go through the process. I'm going to need to be focusing on myself. I'm not going to have a lot of time for phone calls and things like that. So if you call me and I don't respond or don't get back to you right away, it's just because I'm needing some time. I'm needing to focus on myself, and I'll get back to you when I have the energy to do so. And again, that might be uncomfortable, and there might be people who are offended from time to time. But I think we need to really encourage patients going through this to accept that and to be willing to have people get bent out of shape from time to time if that's what happens. We need to be willing to set some boundaries, even when people may not always like it. But that's something that we have to, I use the term being willing to do something uncomfortable in the service of your values. That can be really important. So yeah.
So, Woman, you asked a great question. But I do understand. I want to highlight the privilege that you and I both have. We are the ones that need to create the boundaries with the people we love, because we have great supportive people in our corner. You have your mom, your dad. I have my husband. My children are always constantly bringing me water, making sure I'm okay. Mommy, you're okay. But I want to talk about the warrior that does not have those connections.
Mm-hmm.
What recommendations do you have for those warriors that don't have the connections with family or friends, not only during the curative therapy process, but in their journey as a sickle cell warrior?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one thing that comes to mind is to ask your medical team if you can get connected with a therapist, whether it be a social worker, psychologist, counselor, spiritual counselor, some whatever fits your needs, so that they can help you through that process. The other thing that might be helpful is to ask your medical team if there is someone who's been through the process, someone who's been where you are, that would be willing to talk to you. Because a lot of times there are people like that who would be willing to talk to others. I'm willing to guess the two of you have both talked to other people with sickle cell and been able to tell them, yeah, I went through something similar and here's how I dealt with it. So that can be really helpful as well. There are people out there that they can turn to. You just have to kind of get creative and think outside the box a little bit.
This episode is so delicious. I'm finding that I'm so serious. I feel like this is an intervention for me too. Like this, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I think this is just rich conversation. But I do want to highlight one thing about warriors, even individuals in the curative therapy process, outside of the curative therapy process, even individuals with chronic illness, period. It's so hard for us to find quality mental health. It's just because I don't think we can find a therapist that really understands. So if you could give some tips to warriors that are listening, what are the qualifications? What should we look for in a therapist?
Well, ideally, you would want to work with someone who has some experience working with medical populations, because, like you said, there are a unique set of challenges that you all face. And so that's ideal. I think, and a lot of times you can get that. You can get connected to someone through your medical team that has that expertise. The other thing I'll say is that there are a lot of self-help resources, because I know that therapy is not accessible to everyone, unfortunately, and it's one of the things that is a big problem with our healthcare system. And I won't get off on that soapbox right now, but there are a lot of self-help resources. I'll name just a couple things. One is there are books out there that talk about mindfulness programs for people going through, like, that have chronic pain, for example. One of them is called Full Catastrophe Living, which is a book by John Kabat-Zinn, who's kind of the father of the modern mindfulness movement. There's another one called Get Out of Your Life and Into Your, Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life by Steve Hayes. There's also the model that I practice is called Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, or ACT. There are apps that help people through this model. One is called the ACT Coach, which I use and recommend to people that kind of is like a therapist in your phone. So you can kind of walk through the app and it'll recommend exercises for you and get you to kind of think about your values. And there's mindfulness exercises in there as well. So if you can be creative and look into books, look into podcasts like this, look into apps that are out there. There are a lot of resources. And, what's really helpful sometimes is if you do it with a friend. So find another person who's in your tribe and say, hey, you want to do this app together with me? We can check in on each other's progress. You want to read this book with me? We'll read a chapter a week, something like that. Get a little book club maybe, so that you have another person that you're kind of accountable to, right? And you guys can kind of go through it together and learn together and support each other through that process.
On the next episode of Through the Genes, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Staci Martin as she demonstrates acceptance and commitment therapy in action.
It's a model of therapy that has 6 core constructs, and they are mindfulness or present moment awareness, acceptance, diffusion, which is kind of stepping back from our thoughts, not letting the thoughts control us too rigidly. Something called self as context, which is basically perspective taking and kind of not letting your rigid identity prevent you from living your best life. And then there's values, which we've talked about, and committed action, which is committing to engage in values-based actions. And they all work together to help increase our psychological flexibility.
Through the Genes is funded by the National Human Genome Research Institute, part of the National Institutes of Health, through the Democratizing Education for Sickle Cell Disease Gene Therapy Project. Don't forget to follow Sickle Cell Prodigy and Through the Pain, Inc. for additional resources and initiative updates. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Through the Genes.